Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Antony's invasion of Parthia by Historia Civilis. So, last time we started off in the aftermath of the Battle of Philippi, where Mark Antony and Octavian decisively defeated the remaining conspirators. In the last video, we basically followed Octavian through that post-Philippi time period, where he held dominance over the western portion of the Roman Empire. We were introduced to some new interesting characters and followed what Octavian got up to. In this video, we will be looking at that same time period, but we will be following Mark Antony, seeing what he got up to in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. Interesting stuff. Now, before we jump into the video, I want to give you guys a quick note on the order in which we're reacting to these. So I'm going to show you the playlist I have here. So today, we're watching Antony's invasion. The next video chronologically is War and Peace and War. I reacted to that video when Historia Civilis released it, because he released it recently. So I'm going to leave a link to that video at the top of the description and also in the top right corner right now. So after you watch this one, this is the next one to go to, and I recommend those who watched it before maybe rewatch my reaction. I'm certainly going to rewatch the original video just to remember where we were. And then the one after that, the Battle of Actium, that's the reaction I will be releasing next week. Alright, does that make sense? This one today, Antony's invasion of Parthia, I already uploaded this one, so go and watch that, link in the description. And then we'll come back with the Battle of Actium, and then, actually, we'll be done with these videos on Octavian. The Battle of Actium was the most recent one Historia Civilis uploaded. Of course, I will continue to follow them as he uploads them, but after we're done that one, we move on to other Historia Civilis videos. Exciting stuff. Alright, so, with all of that out of the way, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or channel memberships, through which you can get exclusive reaction content, including Historia Civilis reactions. Now, with all of that said and done, let's jump right into this video. Alright, back to Antony.
In the last video, we followed Caesar's adopted son and political heir Octavian as he returned to Rome, fresh from his victory at Philippi. The city he came back to was one unfamiliar to him, in the midst of a catastrophic economic depression and a famine. Casual, brutal violence gripped the entire region.
Yep, a catastrophic economic depression and famine, which through his actions, Octavian certainly didn't make better, and it could be argued that he made those things much worse.
Over the next 6 years, Octavian made a series of misguided decisions that deepened and prolonged the crisis, resulting in perhaps hundreds of thousands of additional deaths.
I do think this is true. He certainly made some misguided decisions. He also made some decisions which would benefit him and his cause, but not the people as a whole. Coming from a position of power, that's kind of what you have to do if you want to keep power. But what I will say, and many of you pointed this out in the comments, and I am in agreement with you, because, you know, I know a little bit about Octavian. I'm familiar with his entire legacy, including his time as emperor. Historia Civilis definitely has it out for Octavian. He does not like the guy. Now, that is completely fair. I'm not saying you have to like Octavian. I think there's plenty to criticize about Octavian, but I do think, and this is what you guys have pointed out, some of the more brutal events that Historia Civilis has covered in relation to Octavian, he often presents uncritically or without telling us his sources. And sometimes I think some of the stuff he presents may not necessarily be true. They're presented to make Octavian look even worse than he already is. So once again, I'm not saying that Octavian didn't do all of the bad things Historia Civilis is talking about. He did do a lot of them. He made a lot of mistakes. He did a lot of brutal things. Not even mistakes, just, you know, bad things to do. And he did them on purpose. But some of the more extreme stuff, the sources are kind of in question. So I would say when Historia Civilis is going really hard against Octavian, take it with a grain of salt, because some of it might not be entirely true. So just keep that in mind, I would say.
But finally, with a run of good luck, he was able to defeat the rebel boat king Sextus Pompeius and seize control of Sicily, which slowly began to ease the famine. The conflict brought Octavian to the very edge of ruin, but peace brought with it popularity, and
Yes, we saw Octavian cementing his power by the end of last time's episode. He certainly had a tough time and made some mistakes and was incredibly unpopular throughout most of last time's video, but by the end, we saw Octavian seizing territory that was once Sextus Pompeius's. Lepidus actually wanted to seize it, but that didn't happen. Octavian, his popularity was growing because he had defeated the boat king. He was relieving the famine. Stuff was improving. Octavian had a much stronger hand in comparison to where he was earlier. When the first triumvirate first formed, Octavian was the junior partner, but now he holds so much more territory. He really holds the entire western half of the empire. Though the Italian peninsula is supposed to be neutral, it's also basically Octavian's territory. It's his base of operations. So he has certainly grown stronger. I'm curious to see if Mark Antony has as well.
he emerged from the crisis as the unrivaled leader of a unified Roman West.
Yeah.
Antony's situation over this same period was entirely different, as if it were taking place in a parallel universe. The Roman East relied heavily upon the cooperation of local warlords and aristocrats. But over the last decade, Roman negligence had allowed petty disputes between these groups to fester and to grow. Trust was low, and by the time Antony got there, the entire region felt like it was on the verge of being ripped apart by factionalism.
Very interesting. As we saw last time, when we followed Octavian, at times, Octavian and Mark Antony would interact. For example, the treaty they signed with Sextus Pompeius. There were several important events that brought them together, but the way Historia Civilis frames it is basically correct. They were operating completely separately, doing their own thing in their own half of the empire. It was kind of an interesting thing to see, which is why he was able to tell the story of Octavian during this time period and mostly avoid mentioning Antony, even though he literally controls the eastern half of the empire.
After Philippi, Antony took a leisurely tour through the Roman East, aiming to settle these disputes and meet with as many local leaders as possible. In time, a message went out to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, inviting her to come and meet with Antony in the city of Tarsus.
And we have seen Cleopatra before. She was also an important character in Caesar's story, if we remember that. It's interesting. We're seeing a lot of new people emerge. Not necessarily the post-Caesar generation, because it hasn't been that long since Caesar was assassinated, but a bunch of new political figures who may not have been super relevant before, but who are now rising to prominence. But there are also some people who have been relevant and remain relevant. Mark Antony, of course, is the best example, and Cleopatra is another example. She was very important while Caesar was around, and she's still important and will be important to the story of Octavian and Mark Antony.
Egypt was still an independent kingdom, although that independence seemed to be hanging on a knife's edge.
Yeah.
Up until very recently, the country had been compelled to play host to several Roman legions, and there was a concern within Egypt that with the end of the Civil War, the Romans might just decide to bring the legions back, maybe permanently. Egypt, under Cleopatra, had to navigate an impossible path. She had to assert Egypt's independence from a position of relative weakness, but she couldn't do so in a way that provoked a Roman intervention.
Well, and, like I said, we've seen Cleopatra before. In many ways, she was granted her position by the Romans, by Caesar in particular. Now, she was definitely intelligent and capable in her own right, but her getting to the point where she is, that took a lot of assistance from Caesar. And we saw Caesar interfered in Egypt a lot, and frankly, the Egyptians fought back, and he was almost defeated, but he managed to win in the end and escape. So even though Egypt has nominal independence from Rome, they are very much in Rome's sphere of influence, which makes a lot of sense when we see a map of the Roman Empire at this point. Rome holds territory all around Egypt. They hold African territory to the west. They hold territory to the Middle East. Of course, they hold a ton of territory throughout the Mediterranean. So Egypt is sort of slowly being closed in on from every direction.
Cleopatra was well prepared for this moment. She had already placed informants inside Antony's inner circle, who explained to her that Antony was extremely vain, easily influenced by flattery, and not a skilled negotiator.
I mean, we have absolutely seen these traits at play. I am a big critic of Antony. I sometimes think I go a little too hard on him, but I give him credit where it's due. He's genuinely talented in terms of military affairs. But as we've seen, in terms of politics, Antony is not a good negotiator. He wants to do things his way, and he is certainly a vain individual. I feel like we've seen these qualities before, and if Cleopatra can take advantage of them, then she might have an upper hand.
This was enough for Cleopatra to formulate a strategy. She set sail for Tarsus.
Oh, okay. Going to Mark Antony as she went to Caesar.
When Cleopatra's royal barge appeared on the horizon, the residents of Tarsus could not believe their eyes. The ship had been plated with gold and was being propelled through the water by a set of silver oars. The sails had been dyed purple, which we might not find very impressive, but purple dye was so
Royalty.
rare in the ancient world that it was literally worth its weight in gold. Children.
Very rare and often associated with royalty or monarchy. So this whole display would have been very impressive.
Dressed as Eros, or Cupid, the god of desire, crowded the deck of the ship, surrounded by a flock of musicians playing flutes.
Fascinating.
At the center of it all sat Cleopatra, reclined under a golden canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love. To the residents of the city of Tarsus, it appeared as if the gods themselves had personally come to seek an audience with Antony.
Wow.
It was a flattering image, and exactly the kind to which Antony was susceptible. Antony and Cleopatra spent the next 4 days locked in aggressive negotiations. The only thing that Antony really cared about was Parthia. Caesar had been on the Parthian warpath at the time of his death, and as far as Antony was concerned, this was unfinished business. Also, it must be said that Antony wanted a war. Caesar had shown that successful conquest can be a platform from which one can seize power.
This is very true. Parthia, a long time and pretty powerful rival of the Romans. And as I talked about last time, Caesar was talented at both politics and military affairs, but he really built his career off the back of his military conquest. That is what allowed him to rise through the ranks. And I talked about it last time in relation to Octavian, who was very much not talented at military affairs, but was very good at politics. So he was in sort of a unique position. Now, Mark Antony, he has certainly participated in politics in a very important way, but he's not very good at political negotiating. He is far more talented on the military side of things. And so I think rightfully so, he wants to play to his strengths, and he wants to follow the path that Caesar has laid before him. Do some impressive military conquest, build your reputation, build your legacy, and off the back of that, build your political career, build your power. I mean, that's what Pompey Magnus did, that's what Caesar did. This is a well-trodden path in terms of Roman politics, and Caesar showed that, you wouldn't just build political power in a traditional Republican sense, but you could build your own independent base of power from these military conquests. And this is what Mark Antony's going for.
Octavian had his war with Sextus in the west, but that was nothing compared to Parthia.
Oh yeah.
Victory here would outshine Octavian 100-fold. There was no bigger prize. Even though Egypt was an independent kingdom, Cleopatra agreed to help supply a future Roman campaign into Parthia. This was exactly what Antony wanted. But Cleopatra had some concerns of her own. Rome was holding several Egyptian political prisoners, including Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe. Her sister had briefly sat on the Egyptian throne.
I remember we talked about the Romans holding Arsinoe as a prisoner, and I wasn't entirely sure if Caesar did that on purpose. He wanted something to hold above Cleopatra's head, or if the opportunity sort of fell into his lap. But, we saw this happen a couple videos ago.
Which made her a potential rival, a potential replacement. Rome was holding her for a reason. Cleopatra wanted her dead. Antony agreed. Cleopatra then invited Antony to come and spend the winter in Alexandria. It was around this time that the two began a romantic relationship.
Yeah. Cleopatra also began, or a relationship also began between Cleopatra and Caesar. So, this is a common event we've seen with her before.
It's hard to know Cleopatra's precise motivations, because we can't be inside her head. But it seems, based on her actions, that flattering and perhaps even seducing Antony was all part of the plan.
Yeah. And this is sort of a well-known thing about Antony. This is very well remembered in terms of his legacy. The fact that he was basically played by Cleopatra. Now, we don't know if that's exactly what happened, right? We don't know the details. But, like Historia Civilis has just said, it seems like this flattery, seducing him, is potentially all just playing into her plan, and that, she's playing him. But we don't really know, I guess.
Military preparations for a Roman invasion of Parthia continued all winter, and Antony made no attempt to conceal his plans. And so maybe it shouldn't have come as a surprise when the Parthians launched a preemptive attack and invaded Syria in the spring of 40 B.C.E. Antony immediately abandoned his little Egyptian vacation and went to Greece to raise additional legions. When he arrived, he learned that the man that he had appointed governor in Syria had been captured and executed by the Parthians.
Uh-oh.
In Greece, Antony began receiving regular updates from the Roman West once more. The rebellion ignited by his brother Lucius and his wife Fulvia had just ended in failure, which means that at their greatest moment of peril, Antony had been hanging out with his girlfriend in a different country with his phone turned off.
That is a good way of putting it. Yeah, we saw last time that a revolt against Octavian had been started by, in particular, Antony's brother, but Antony's wife had also joined in. And there was a big question of, how involved was Antony? I think it's possible that he wasn't really involved at all, but it's also possible that, he knew some stuff behind the scenes, and he told his brother, do what you want to do, and he was just waiting to see how this revolt turned out to decide if he would get involved or not. But basically, there was all this Antonian action going on west against Octavian, and Antony stayed well away from it. He was not involved, at least in actually doing the revolt.
Was this on purpose? Did he strategically make himself unreachable at this time?
Maybe.
Perhaps. Antony and Fulvia reunited in Greece, but within a few months, Fulvia fell ill and died.
Yeah.
We're told that she died of natural causes, but we're also told that she, quote, aggravated her illness deliberately, to which I say, what? Here's another data point.
Look, I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist, but we have a lot of deaths from natural causes in Roman history that seem very suspect, and I reckon that this is one of them.
The moment that Fulvia fell ill, Antony had just learned that Cleopatra gave birth to twins. We know that the couple thought that this was an historic occasion because they would later name the children Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon.
Yep.
It was at this pivotal moment that Fulvia mysteriously fell ill and died. I'm not saying there was foul play. I'm just saying that Antony definitely murdered his wife.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously from a historical perspective, we don't know. A lot of these things we just don't know. This is how history, and in particular ancient history, plays out. We do not have the details. We don't have the sources to support some of these accusations. All we can do is look at the situation, look at what we've been told, which is that she died from natural causes, and think, that's pretty convenient. That is a little suspicious. And there definitely seems to be what I think is a fairly high chance that there was foul play involved.
Meanwhile, Antony received a letter from his mother in Rome. She claimed that Sextus Pompeius had contacted her and wanted to form an alliance with Antony against Octavian. Antony replied non-committally. Sextus must have found this answer a little confusing because Antony's wife and brother had just attempted to stage a coup. This decision...
Yeah, I mean, we can see, and we kind of got this from the video last time following Octavian, but we can see from Antony's perspective how sort of separated he is from everything going on in the West, how non-committal he is towards everything. Even a revolt held by his own brother, he didn't really want to be involved. I mean, maybe that was an accident, but it seems like it might have been on purpose.
To keep Sextus at arm's length started looking like a mistake almost immediately, because when one of Antony's generals in Gaul unexpectedly died, Octavian used the opportunity to move against him and seize control of 11 of his Gallic legions. Antony dropped his preparations for the Parthian campaign at once and departed for Italy with whatever strength he could muster. After a brief standoff, the two agreed to re-split the Roman world. The Treaty of Bundesium gave Antony the east, Octavian the west, and Lepidus the province of Africa. The idea behind this new arrangement was to prevent future incidents like this by giving everybody clearly defined areas of influence.
Hey, but as you can see from that change, now this deal did stabilize the situation, which is what Antony wanted. It prevented him and Octavian from beefing with each other for a little bit, but clearly Octavian has strengthened his hand. From the political maneuvering he's been doing out west to him seizing Antony's legions, now those things have basically been cemented. And remember, by the end of this time period, Octavian will also have taken all that territory which belonged to Sextus Pompeius and Lepidus. So Octavian is really strengthening his position, whereas so far Antony really hasn't done that. And in fact, he is losing strength to Octavian. So, I mean, you can kind of see who is rising and who is stagnating or kind of falling in the order. But it is worth remembering Antony still holds a lot of power, a lot of political power, military power, influence. So, I'm not trying to write him off, but, you can sort of see what's going on here.
Antony was fine making these concessions. His entire focus was on the upcoming Parthian campaign.
Yeah.
The treaty was finalized with a marriage between Antony and Octavian's sister. It's a really weird coincidence that this marriage was only made possible by the untimely death of Antony's wife. Again, I'm not saying that Antony murdered his wife, but he did do that, and I am saying that, and he should be in jail.
Oh, wow.
Antony stuck around for a while and helped Octavian negotiate a new deal with Sextus. When that wrapped up, Antony returned to Greece. In the meantime, the Parthians, facing minimal opposition, had penetrated deep into Roman territory. After taking the province of Syria, they split their invasion force and launched simultaneous attacks against Asia Minor to the north and Judea to the south, which was a semi-independent puppet kingdom under Roman influence.
Yep.
The southern offensive into Judea was personally led by the son of the Parthian king.
Ooh.
The northern offensive into Asia Minor was led by none other than the son of Caesar's old right-hand man, Labienus.
How about that? Labienus popping up again. I did not expect to see him come up again. Very interesting. One of the few opponents of Caesar that lasted quite a long time until Caesar defeated him in battle. And, ever since Caesar defeated all of the Pompeian resistance, it was basically all Caesar all the time. Everyone was a Caesarian, or at least everyone pretended to be a Caesarian, because there was no point being a Pompeian when Caesar is the tyrant of Rome, basically. So seeing some remnants of Pompeian influence, such as Labienus, or the son of Labienus, or last time Sextus Pompeius, is always sort of an interesting thing to see at this point. And we can also see that Antony's got a lot to deal with. He's got the Parthians invading from the east, he's got Octavian to worry about out west, he's got Cleopatra and Egypt to consider, and he kind of seems to be struggling to do everything at once, whereas, Octavian also had a lot to worry about. He had Sextus Pompeius, he had the relationship with Antony, he had the political situation in Rome and the Italian peninsula itself, but it seemed like it did a better job of handling all of those things and seizing opportunities where he saw them, like taking those legions in Gaul, which was supposedly Antony's territory.
Antony's reorganization of the Roman East left him deeply unpopular with some aristocrats, and so each Parthian army was able to pick up local support as they advanced. While Antony was struggling to mobilize a large-scale response, he placed a small advance force of maybe 2 legions under the command of a general named Ventidius, and sent him east to slow the son of Labienus down. With very little resources, and an impossible task ahead of him, Ventidius exceeded everybody's expectations.
Okay.
He occupied a narrow mountain pass called the Cilician Gates, and provoked a Parthian attack. The superior Roman infantry held their ground, and then attacked downhill, turning the Parthian army and securing a minor victory.
Wow, okay, shout out Ventidius. I have never heard of this guy before, but good job.
But even more importantly, the son of Labienus was captured during the confusion. Ventidius ordered him put to death. In one move, the northern Parthian advance had been stopped in its tracks.
Damn.
In the aftermath, each side scrambled for control of another key choke point, called the Amanus Pass. But when Ventidius threw all of his strength into it, he won that battle as well. Ventidius's job had been to slow the Parthian advance, while Antony built his strength. But that wasn't what was happening. Ventidius was accidentally winning the entire campaign.
Wow.
In 2 moves.
He's too good. No one expected this to happen. This Ventidius guy came out of nowhere, and he's just dominating.
The Parthians had been pushed all the way back to Syria. Off to the south, the son of the Parthian king heard about the collapse of the northern campaign and pulled out of Judea.
Wow.
By the time Ventidius reached Syria, he had received some reinforcements from Antony. How many reinforcements? Hard to say. When did this happen? Also hard to say. The sources surrounding this incident are bad. The 2 Parthian armies combined their forces and advanced once more.
Okay, so this went from Ventidius being a small force sent to hold off the Parthian advance to now Ventidius is doing the whole thing on his own with some reinforcements from Antony. We don't know how many. Ventidius could just defeat this invasion all on his lonesome with virtually no involvement from Antony himself.
The Romans awaited them at a site called Mount Gandarus. In each of the 2 previous battles, as soon as the Parthians were forced to confront the Roman infantry directly, they fled. Ventidius suspected that this might happen a 3rd time, and so he tricked the Parthians into believing that his little army had been badly weakened, when in fact they had only been strengthened by reinforcements.
Damn.
As predicted, the Parthians pulled back when they encountered the Roman infantry, but this time they ran straight into an ambush.
Oh,
The Parthian invaders were obliterated, and the son of the Parthian king was killed. The Senate and people of Rome would later reward Ventidius with a triumph.
Yeah, shout out Ventidius. Also, I'm always talking about how, out of everything, Antony was actually good at being a military leader. But this is what I would call an Octavian-style victory. You stay away from the battle, and send your subordinates to do the fighting for you. This is what Octavian does. Fortunately, he has Agrippa to do the fighting for him. And in this case, Ventidius comes out of nowhere and does everything for Mark Antony. So, very interesting.
Well deserved, in my opinion. Antony moved quickly to reestablish control over the Roman East. He brought Judea back under Roman influence by elevating a pro-Roman ruler named Herod and helping him purge Parthian sympathizers from the kingdom. Around this time, Antony traveled back.
This is obviously a very interesting time in Judea's history. We're in the 40s/30s BC. We're coming on to some very interesting biblical times. I'm not a biblical scholar, nor do I know too much about Christian and Jewish texts, but this is certainly an interesting time in the history of Judea, both from a religious perspective and a political perspective. I mean, Rome is really establishing its control over the region, so very fascinating stuff there.
West, and offered to give Octavian some ships in exchange for some legions. We now fully understand why. Antony had just seen the Roman East overrun by the Parthians, and, as I covered in the last video, Octavian had his own problems with the Boat King.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for Antony, Octavian never got around to sending his legions east. Or, let's just say that when he did get around to sending his legions east, it was not in the way that Antony expected.
Okay, a little bit of foreshadowing there.
Antony's long-awaited invasion of Parthia finally came in 36 BCE. Antony had spent years thinking about how to approach this campaign. The last Roman general to attempt an invasion had been soundly defeated by the Parthian cavalry at the Battle of Carrhae. This defeat taught Antony
a pretty pathetic failure from Crassus. Pretty disappointing moment in Roman history, frankly. Crassus always wanted to be a general. He didn't just want to be some rich guy sitting on the sidelines. He wanted to get involved. Well, we saw what happened when he did get involved. So I'm curious to see how Antony is going to approach this. This is definitely a risky maneuver, and of course Octavian had his own thing to deal with, Sextus Pompeius, but there's definitely, I think, a big difference. Sextus Pompeius was occupying Roman territory, Octavian's territory, basically. He was in Octavian's backyard, and so Octavian and Lepidus teamed up to basically reclaim that land, further cementing Octavian's position. And Octavian organized the whole thing from the Italian peninsula. Versus Antony, he is at the Roman frontier, right? He is far away from the center of power, and he wants to go further, invade Parthian territory, extend Roman borders. I think it's definitely a more risky proposition than whatever Octavian was up to. Now, because it's so risky, it could yield amazing results. Antony could conquer more territory for Rome. That's one of the most impressive things you can do as a leader or as a general, and that would really build his political position. It would probably bring him a lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of influence. But, it's risky, so it could also lead to some very disappointing defeats, which could seriously weaken Mark Antony's position. We're going to see exactly how it goes.
A valuable lesson. Instead of pushing east, Antony would march north and cut through Rome's ally of Armenia. Antony's basic theory was that the open plains of Mesopotamia made the Parthian cavalry virtually unstoppable. The hills and mountains of Armenia, on the other hand, would be much more conducive to...
I always liked seeing countries like Armenia, or what was at the time called Iberia, or what we would call Georgia, pop up, because, these are countries that exist in the modern day, but their history is so ancient that we can see, of course, a lot has changed over this time period. Armenia of today is extremely different than the Armenia of this era. It's difficult to draw a straight line through the country's history, and that's true for any country in the modern day. But there is some semblance of the modern-day country of Armenia that existed at this point and was, a fully formed state, nation. I always think that's really interesting to see because, of course, if we look throughout the world, particularly throughout Europe, there are a lot of different groups who will be gone soon. They'll have migrated or, be defeated and, assimilated into another culture or whatever. So it's interesting to see some sort of stability, something that existed then that still, in some way or another, exists now.
The Roman infantry and their style of fighting. If the Parthians were foolish enough to throw their cavalry against the mountains of Armenia, let them. If not, Antony could march east and then south, and then he would have a Roman army on the Persian plateau, threatening the heart of the Parthian Empire. I've got to say, I don't hate this strategy. Say what you will about Antony, and I have, and I will, but he did the work of studying previous Roman defeats and actually learned something.
Okay.
If Antony...
I'll let you guys judge that in the comments. I'm not really sure whether it's a good plan or not. It at least seems different, which I think is good. Maybe some of you who are more familiar with military history of this era can give me your own thoughts on how good or bad Antony's plan is. Do you think this was the best possible way to invade the Parthian Empire? Or do you think he could have done something different? I don't know.
Antony was going to march all the way into the heart of the Parthian Empire. He would need Egypt's full support. Cleopatra had already promised to supply the upcoming campaign, but Antony needed to be sure. He couldn't have the most powerful kingdom in the region doing anything unexpected while he was thousands of kilometers away. Antony and Cleopatra got together and discussed.
Antony, I mentioned how Antony's expedition is more risky than what Octavian is doing, for the reasons I mentioned then. But also, as we just saw on the map, Antony is also dealing with a lot more geopolitics than Octavian is. Octavian is primarily dealing with domestic politics, which, don't get me wrong, those are difficult in their own right. But geopolitics can be hard to predict sometimes, right? Antony's dealing with Egypt and Cleopatra, and though they may have a relationship, she acts independently, right? She's intelligent, and I'm not saying she's untrustworthy, but she's untrustworthy, right? She's going to do whatever is going to benefit her position and her kingdom the most. He has to deal with the Parthians. He has to deal with Armenia. There's a lot of different variables that Antony has to keep in mind that can very much complicate the situation.
The future of Egypt. Rome would support Egypt acquiring a bunch of new territory up the Mediterranean coast. From Antony's perspective,
that is massive expansion. Though I'm seeing at the top, Rome would continue to administer some of this territory in Egypt's name. It was more like a Rome-Egypt partnership. That's very interesting. I guess that makes it less extreme, but that is still pretty massive territorial expansion from Egypt into Rome's sphere of influence. Fascinating.
This would guarantee Egyptian cooperation if the Parthians ever invaded again. From Cleopatra's perspective, this elevated Egypt to its most powerful position in 2 centuries.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody was happy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's tricky because, Egypt would still be in a partnership with Rome, and in some ways, a bit of a Roman puppet state, but the more territory Egypt can gain, and particularly if it can administer some or all of that territory, the more power it gains and the more independence it probably gains. Though, also, I'm sure at this point, Cleopatra feels like, as I mentioned before, Rome is closing in on every side, and so in order for Egypt to survive and for Egypt to thrive, she probably has to partner with the Romans instead of being crushed by them. I'd imagine that's also something that she's thinking about.
Speaking of being happy, it was around this time that Cleopatra became pregnant once more.
Okay.
With somewhere between 15 and 18 legions under his command, Antony launched his invasion of Parthia.
All right.
As planned, he marched north and cut through the friendly kingdom of Armenia.
Let's see how this
The
goes.
first phase of this campaign appears to have been successful because the Parthians in the Mesopotamian lowlands were caught completely flat-footed. As Antony advanced through the mountains of Armenia, he knew that time was of the essence. For the sake of speed, he allowed the baggage train to lag behind while the main army marched ahead.
Okay. I mean, once again, risky, but sometimes you have to take decisive action. I mean, this is something that we saw Caesar do repeatedly, leave his baggage train or leave his supplies behind as he forged ahead into enemy territory. And it worked out for him. Now, Mark Antony isn't quite Caesar, but this could work out for him. It may not. Let's see.
Eventually, they emerged into Parthian territory, where he immediately laid siege to the city of Frata? 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 Just a side note.
Frata?
This was technically the capital city of a separate kingdom called... Oh boy. We're just gonna throw it away with confidence.
Oh, you could say that. Come on. I believe in you, Historia Civilis.
Media Atropatene, which was
Sounds about right.
closely aligned with Parthia. This is not an important distinction, since every map I've seen just goes ahead and counts this as part of the Parthian Empire, but I only mention it because Antony's objective here may have been to split Media Atropatene away from Parthia and into the Roman sphere of influence. As Antony was settling into the siege of Frata, Roman supplies were still slowly snaking their way through the mountains of Armenia.
Yeah.
With no warning, the Parthians attacked. But they didn't attack Antony. They attacked the baggage train, a small military force under the command...
Okay, that's a pretty smart response. The Parthians have been, caught surprised by Mark Antony, but they're not going straight for him. They're not completely flat-footed. They've taken the time to think about what exactly should we do, and they're going for his baggage train. That's smart.
Of the Armenian king was quickly defeated, and the majority of Roman supplies were taken or destroyed.
Damn.
And by Roman supplies, I mean Cleopatra's supplies, since Antony had asked her to back this entire campaign. Oopsie doopsie. All accounts of this event come to us through ProAnthony Sources, so it shouldn't be too surprising that they blame everybody except Antony. There's an accusation made that the Armenian king stabbed Antony in the back and tipped off the Parthians. There's also some talk that there may have been a Parthian spy in Antony's inner circle. Maybe this is true, but the likeliest scenario is that Antony simply miscalculated.
Yep, once again, we have to look at the sources we have. Sources are always biased, right? So we have to look at who has written each source, from what perspective they view things, which direction they're biased in, why are they biased in that direction. In this case, we have some pro-Antony sources. Now, sure, any one of those reasons they listed could have been true. We don't know. But it also could be that, as Historia Civilis put it, Antony screwed up. And to be honest, though it does seem like Antony did his research for this campaign, I feel like he's been pretty damn aloof throughout, this whole time. He's been letting his subordinates do the work for him. He has not really been doing what he needs to do. I don't know. He seems to be taking things a little too slowly and not approaching things with the intensity that they deserve. So I would absolutely believe that Antony missed something or entrusted something to someone else who maybe didn't do a good job, or basically I could definitely see this being Antony's responsibility at the end of the day.
And the Parthians pounced. Despite this early setback, Antony pressed on. If they could win the siege of Frata, all of their supply problems would be solved. That's a polite way of saying that they would loot the city.
Yep.
But the city was better defended than Antony had anticipated, and when the Parthians descended on Frata and began conducting hit-and-run attacks, it only made matters worse. The Romans had a hard time building and defending siege equipment.
Uh-oh.
Antony kept up the fight for as long as he could, but he was up against the clock. At the last possible moment, he made the heartbreaking decision to abandon the siege.
Damn.
He turned around and began the long march back to Armenia.
Yeah, Antony has tried to follow in Caesar's footsteps, and, just like Caesar always did, got himself stuck in enemy territory with no supplies. But we didn't usually see Caesar doing this, slinking away from a possible victory and retreating. I mean, Sometimes we did. Look at Caesar's time in Egypt, for example. That went horribly, but we think about Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Caesar always found a way to succeed. And that's probably due to the difference between Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. There's also probably difference between being trapped in Gallic enemy territory and being trapped in Parthian enemy territory. Parthia is a big, powerful, organized empire in its own right. It rivals the Roman Empire in some ways. Rome is definitely more powerful. I'm sure it's got an organized army. It's got a lot of resources. So that's a lot to deal with compared to Caesar, who was generally going up against less well-trained and less organized enemies. Now, Caesar went up against numerically superior enemies and enemies who had more supplies or more resources, but you can be sure that when Julius Caesar was going up against these Gallic tribes, the Romans were better trained and better organized. And they probably were in this case as well. I don't know too much about the Parthian Empire, but I would imagine that the Parthians were maybe a little bit more of a match for the Romans than, say, some random Gallic tribes were. But this could also be mostly down to Antony just messing up.
The idea had always been to spend the winter in Parthian territory. Nobody had planned for an early retreat. The Parthian cavalry harassed the Romans all the way back to Armenia, impeding their progress and exhausting their soldiers. By the time they reached the mountains of Armenia, the weather had begun to turn. Snowstorms slowed their process even further, and
look, we're not quite at the end of Antony's Parthian campaign yet, but if we think back on the Roman political situation, Antony wanted to do this to build his base of power, build his popularity, probably loot some cash money and resources from the Parthians to improve the prosperity of his camp in comparison to Octavian's. Instead, he's been embarrassingly defeated. He's probably going to lose a lot of men due to starvation, disease, this difficult march back to Roman territory, and these hit-and-run attacks from the Parthians. So he certainly hasn't improved his popularity. This sort of devastating loss is not good for your popularity or your legacy. He's going to come out of this probably with less money, less resources, less men, less influence, less popularity. I talked about at the beginning how this campaign was risky. There were both pros and cons, and now we're seeing the cons in practice.
Food rations were cut to a bare minimum. Antony tried to keep pushing forward, but nobody had packed any winter clothing. Soldiers were forced to trudge through the snow in their Mediterranean-style sandals, with their bare legs exposed.
Jeez.
Through all of this, persistent Parthian cavalry raids forced the Romans to stop several times a day. By the time
Also, we talked about Crassus earlier, but the Parthians are just taking W's against the Romans. I mean, Ventidius had some impressive successes against the Parthians, but that was in Roman territory. Seems like every time the Romans try to invade Parthian territory, they get their asses whooped and sent back to Rome, sometimes in a body bag.
Antony limped all the way back to Syria. He had lost between 25 and 50% of his army to starvation or the cold. The survivors no longer resembled soldiers. They were disturbingly thin and dressed in rags, many having left their armor behind in the snow.
Jesus.
As soon as Antony was able, he sent a letter to Cleopatra requesting money, food, and winter clothing. The survivors of the Parthian campaign then huddled next to the coast, fearful that a Parthian counterattack was imminent. Antony also wrote to Octavian and the Roman Senate, characterizing the Parthian campaign as a victory. I'll let you decide whether starving to death on the side of a mountain counts as a victory.
I will say this is another way in which he's following in the footsteps of Caesar. We've always talked about how Caesar was fantastic at PR. He was great at marketing himself and his accomplishments, and sometimes his losses. Now, to be fair, Caesar was usually successful in these sort of military affairs, but sometimes he wasn't successful, or sometimes his success wasn't very impressive. But he would always send his little letters, his press release back to Rome, talking about his impressive, magnificent victory against overwhelming odds, just to make sure everyone could hear about it. That is what Antony is trying to do, but with a loss so devastating, I'm sure a word is going to get back to Rome independently about how badly the campaign went.
He ended by asking for those legions that Octavian had promised him a year ago. Octavian gave him every excuse in the book. The legions weren't ready, problems with recruitment, blah blah blah. It was around this time that Antony took to heavy drinking.
Oh. Uh-oh. He's spiraling.
Despite having falsely claimed victory, Antony spent the next year going around and propagating this story about how the Armenians stabbed Rome in the back.
Okay, so, by the way, that shows that Antony's tale of victory against the Parthians probably wasn't generally believed, because he felt the need to go around and talk about how his loss was caused by Armenian betrayal. It wasn't his fault.
In 34 BCE, he used this as pretext for an invasion. Armenia didn't stand a chance, and in no time at all, the Armenian king was captured, and the war was over.
Okay, I imagine Antony wants to make this look like his impressive victory, but using what was probably false pretext to invade your ally and much weaker neighbor, and then claim victory. It's not really impressive, is it? It's definitely not as impressive as invading and winning against the Parthians. Now, that would have been impressive.
This recrimination against Armenia stinks of injured pride and a bruised ego.
Yeah.
It also proves that Antony was not a particularly deep political thinker. The king of Armenia had always favored an alliance with Rome, but his son was of a different mind and favored an alliance with Parthia.
Ooh.
Well, within a couple of years, that's exactly what happened. This drift toward Parthia left Rome in an objectively worse geopolitical situation. But hey, at least Antony felt better.
I mean, look, we know Antony's not good at politics. We've seen this before. And also that geopolitical aspect comes back into it. I talked about the complexity of the geopolitics earlier. And frankly, someone like Octavian would have been much better suited to dealing with these geopolitics than Antony. Octavian, he's able to negotiate. He's not very emotional. He probably would have found a better solution in comparison to Antony, who is more emotional, more rash, throws himself into things without necessarily thinking of the consequences. We've seen this time and time again. So Antony was really not suited for this sort of geopolitical maneuvering.
Back in Alexandria, Antony celebrated a triumph and humiliated the Armenian king by using him as a centerpiece in the celebration.
Jeez.
Unsurprisingly, their earlier defeat at the hands of the Parthians was not mentioned. Some time after the triumph, Antony orchestrated a bizarre event known to history as the Donations of Alexandria.
Oh, okay. Yep, I've definitely heard of this. I think I vaguely remember what this is. This is a very interesting event.
Place in the Gymnasium of Alexandria, which was a structure more than 200 meters in length, described by Strabo as the most beautiful building in the city. Before a packed crowd, Antony and Cleopatra sat upon...
And by the way, you can also already see, and I think this is about to be proven, how Antony is sort of shifting the center of power in the east from wherever it was before. Eventually, it'll be Constantinople, but I don't know where the center of power in the east is right now. I would imagine maybe in Greece, or maybe somewhere else. I don't know. But he's shifting that center of power towards Egypt, Alexandria. And to be fair, Alexandria is an extremely important and influential city. All these dealings with Cleopatra, this joint Egyptian-Roman partnership, asking Cleopatra for supplies, holding his triumph in Alexandria, all of this stuff is being shifted towards Egypt, towards Alexandria, and what's about to happen is only going to confirm that.
On thrones, dressed as gods. Antony addressed the crowd and opened with a shocking revelation. Years earlier, Caesar and Cleopatra had secretly been married, which meant that Cleopatra's child, Caesarion, now around 13 years old, was in fact Caesar's legitimate heir.
Yeah.
The problem with this claim was that it was not true.
Of course it wasn't. Like, secret marriage, not a chance. You know, Caesar and Cleopatra had a relationship, they messed around, all that stuff is true, but this whole secret marriage story, I don't think so. This is just obviously Antony trying to gain an advantage over Octavian, who Caesar adopted and named as his heir. But, I mean, even if this was true, which it isn't, Caesar has clearly chosen Octavian. That's what he did. He bequeathed his legacy, his political power, onto Octavian. And at this point, Octavian is pretty damn powerful in his own right. So, you know, you can see what Antony is doing, but I don't think it's going to work.
No other source says anything about a secret marriage. And even if it did, Caesar was already married. It would have been illegal. Yeah. But Antony made the claim anyways. Why? Because elevating Caesarion served a strategic purpose. Who would this hurt? Octavian, of course.
Yep.
We'll get around to Octavian's response later, but for now, Antony had more to say. He reaffirmed his support for Cleopatra and Caesarion as the legitimate rulers of Egypt, and then went one step further and bestowed new titles upon each of them. Queen of Kings for Cleopatra and King of Kings for Caesarion.
I like the Queen of Kings. That's interesting because King of Kings, you know, that makes sense. King of Kings. You were the king at the top of all the other kings. I guess Queen of Kings also makes sense, but it just sounds wrong. You would expect Queen of Queens, right?
These titles had a special significance in the region. It put them up on the same level as the King of Parthia.
Yep. And this is what Persian rulers always called themselves. The Parthians, the Sassanids, King of Kings.
Cleopatra was to oversee a vast expansion of Egyptian territory and preside over a group of lesser kings that would administer their territory in her name. Some of these lesser kings were to be her own children. Antony then turned to his son, Alexander Helios, now 5 or 6 years old. To Alexander, he conferred the following titles: the King of Armenia, the King of Media, and the King of Parthia. Like I said, these titles were to be subordinate to Egypt and to Egypt's
King of Parthia. Okay, well, you don't quite have control over Parthia yet, so that's a pretty ambitious one.
queen. If you were paying attention, you might have noticed that none of these titles were Antony's to give. Most of this territory was outside of Roman influence, and even recently defeated Armenia had already gone ahead and selected a new king. You might say that these titles were aspirational.
Yeah.
To Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios' twin sister, Antony granted a much more modest but realistic set of titles: Queen of Cyrenaica and Queen of Crete. Again, these would be subordinate to Cleopatra.
And so we can see, and we're not done with this yet, but as I said, Antony is shifting the center of power in the eastern chunk of the Roman Empire towards Alexandria. He's reorienting the Roman East around Egypt. Egypt will be the new base of power. I was going to say the new base of Roman power, but it's not even that. It's more like the new base of Roman-Egyptian power. He's basically extending this partnership that he offered to Cleopatra. Of course, Rome is the senior partner. Obviously, Rome has a massive empire, far more influential than Egypt is. But you can sort of see Antony is trying to establish for himself this sort of independent system, this independent power base of Roman-Egyptian power. Very interesting, very ambitious, but extremely different from what is going on at the moment. This is a big change from the Roman status quo, and, you know, you can bet a lot of people are not going to like that.
While Cyrenaica and Crete weren't exactly the greatest prizes, they did have the benefit of being territory that was actually under Egypt's control. Antony and Cleopatra's 2-year-old son, whom they had named Ptolemy Philadelphus, received titles as well. Again, these would all be subordinate to the ruler of Egypt. Ptolemy Philadelphus would become the king of Syria, the king of Phoenicia, and the king of Cilicia. Don't get too thrown off by the title King of Syria. It seems that Antony's idea was for the king of Syria to provide a much-needed buffer between the Roman province of Syria and the rest of the world. People sometimes mischaracterize the donations of Alexandria as Antony giving away Roman territory, but that's not what happened here. Antony's goal was to fundamentally reorganize the Roman East.
Yeah, and that's the point I was making. It's not that he's giving it away, he is developing this new sort of Roman-Egyptian system to organize the East. In fact, not just the east of the Roman Empire, the Eastern world, the fact that he included all of Parthia. So it would be unfair to say that Antony is just giving away the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire to Egypt. That's not what's happening. But it is definitely a very interesting way of doing things, and does definitely show a separation from the center of power in Rome itself. You know, this is definitely more autonomous than the system is at the moment.
Into a stable system of alliances that would hold up over generations. The Roman East was a relatively new concept. The first Roman tiptoes into Asia Minor began only 100 years ago, and the Roman presence in places like Syria was only 30 years old. Regional stability relied on support from allies like Thrace, Lycia, Galatia, Armenia, and Judea. But recent history had taught Antony that this system sucked. These allies had no love for Rome, and at first opportunity they switched sides like it was nothing. The constant threat of a Parthian invasion meant that Rome couldn't really do anything about this. They just had to accept weak allied support when they could get it.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense. The Roman East, which as Historia Civilis pointed out, is a newly developing concept. Of course, in the future, the Roman East will become very important. In fact, it will eventually become the center of the Roman Empire, basically. So that makes sense, and I do agree that some reorganization has to happen, but I do feel like Antony's system that he's trying to implement is a little too complicated and also too foreign to the Romans. This whole system of everyone being under the monarch of Egypt and then king of this province and king of that province, I feel like that doesn't read well to most Roman citizens. It seems very far away, very foreign, and sort of comes across as not true Roman leadership, not true Roman rule of these provinces, even though, of course, it basically is. Rome is still in control. This is all still in Rome's sphere of influence, but it's just very different from the status quo. And though the status quo isn't great, I'm not entirely sure if this is the best direction to go in.
Antony's idea was to develop an interconnected system of alliances, using Egypt as a central hub.
Yeah.
Distant territories like Armenia, Cyrenaica, and Cilicia would be linked together through their relationship with Egypt.
And once again, to be fair, eventually Constantinople will be the center of the Roman East, but Alexandria will always be important. And at this point, and I would love for someone to correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know too much about the Roman East of this era, but I imagine that Alexandria is probably the most important city of this Eastern Mediterranean region, right? I'm not sure what other cities would be in competition, but Alexandria is super influential. So it does make sense to sort of bring that into the Roman sphere of influence and have that be sort of the center of this new system of organization. But I think you could do that in sort of different ways.
The system would be self-policing. Opportunistically switching sides would mean incurring the wrath of this expanded Egyptian empire. In order for this system to work, all Rome had to do was maintain a strong partnership with Egypt. So far, so good with Cleopatra. Who was next in line after her? The son of Julius Caesar, a Roman on the Egyptian throne.
Yes, but once again, you are giving a lot of power and a lot of autonomy to this Egyptian empire. And you have Cleopatra on the throne, and then the supposed legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. No one believes that. But what about the future? Like I said, I feel like this seems very foreign to the Roman Empire. At least giving this much control to a Roman ally, a Roman client state. And it gives Egypt a lot of independent power, honestly, that they could probably use against the Roman center in the future.
You can agree or disagree with Antony's strategic vision, but I wanted to make it clear that the idea was logically sound. I would argue that it was putting a lot of eggs into one Egypt-shaped basket.
That's exactly it. I also think it's logically sound. I don't think it's like a ridiculous idea, but that's exactly it. You're putting a lot of eggs into one basket, and that basket is Egypt. If something doesn't go your way, or Egypt goes in a direction you're not expecting, then the Roman East, and Mark Antony by extension, would be in a lot of trouble.
But that was Antony's decision. He wasn't losing his mind, and he wasn't turning his back on the people of Rome. It was a real strategy, designed to provide regional stability far into the future. But that wasn't how things were characterized in the West.
Yeah, and Historia Civilis is giving these disclaimers because of how this is going to be received in the western part of the Roman Empire. And yes, that I agree. This is a organization that I have a lot of critiques of, but Antony is not losing his mind. He's not turning his back on Rome. That's the important part. But from my perspective, and I've made my perspective pretty clear, I think if you're a Roman, particularly in the West, I could forgive you for thinking that Antony is turning his back to Rome, turning away from Rome towards Egypt, because that is definitely what it seems like. And you can definitely twist that in your favor if you're Octavian.
When Antony submitted his plan to the Roman Senate for their approval, Octavian threw a fit. His entire political identity was wrapped up in being Caesar's only son and heir. And now, Antony was claiming that Caesar had another son on the Egyptian throne. It was a direct challenge to Octavian. At this time, Octavian had just recently defeated Sextus Pompeius and recaptured Sicily. He was popular for the first time in his political career. He decided to use that against Antony. At Octavian's direction, the Roman Senate denied Antony's reorganization of the Roman East. This was a massive breach in their agreement. Antony was supposed to have a free hand to do as he wished in the territory under his control. Now, that was being taken away from him.
Though, to be fair, and that is true, this is definitely a breach of their agreement, but Antony's basically taking pot shots at Octavian from the east, naming Caesarion as the legitimate heir of Caesar. This is a shot at Octavian, so you can see why Octavian feels justified to take a shot back, even if it does disrupt the agreement between the two.
Octavian then went to the people of Rome. He pretended to be outraged over the fact that Antony staged a Roman triumph on foreign soil.
Yeah.
He used the incident as proof that Antony had betrayed Rome and thrown in his lot with the Egyptians.
And once again, that's not entirely true, but first off, frankly, I think it's partially true. Antony is giving so much power to Egypt. And second off, you can see why this would be pretty easy to believe for a lot of people, considering all the things that Antony has done.
He twisted the donations of Alexandria to fit this narrative, and told the people of Rome that Antony was setting up a dynasty for himself at Rome's expense. But of course...
Yeah, so I don't think that's necessarily true. But, Historia Civilis says, and I put it this way too, Octavian twisted it. Man, it doesn't take much twisting to take what Antony did and sell it to the people as a betrayal of Rome, right? I think the idea of Mark Antony making himself king of this new dynasty, that's definitely not true. And that's sort of far-fetched. But the rest of it, that's kind of close, or at least it appears close to what actually happened.
That wasn't what Antony was doing. He was trying to make the Roman East more resilient. But the truth didn't matter. Maybe Octavian had always planned on turning against Antony, or maybe the Caesarian thing spooked him into rethinking their relationship. But either way, his goal was now to pick a fight. When the agreement between Antony and Octavian came up for renewal in 33 BCE, both sides just let it expire. The second triumvirate was dead. Bad politics had allowed the combined military strength of the entire Roman Empire to fall into the hands of two people. It was only a matter of time before one began.
I mean, it's been that way for a while. We had Julius Caesar and Pompey, and then after the death of Pompey, of course, it was Caesar versus a range of Pompeians. Then it was just Caesar alone. So this whole past couple of years has been characterized by the authoritarian leadership of a couple of individuals who hold immense political and military power. At the moment, there are two of those individuals. Lepidus has been, put into forced retirement by Octavian. And soon-ish, there's only going to be one of those individuals at the top.
Began to see the other as a direct threat to their power. And once that happened, a civil war became inevitable.
Wait for it. There we go. We always gotta wait for the outro. And once again, I'll bring you back to this playlist. Remember, today was Antony's invasion of Parthia. The next video chronologically is War and Peace and War, which I already reacted to. Like I said, the link is at the top of the description. I'm definitely going to be rewatching that one, so I would recommend you rewatch my reaction, because the next Historia Civilis reaction I will upload will be the one after War and Peace and War, the Battle of Actium. Okay, so just wanted to clear that up again. I enjoyed this one. I do sort of disagree with Historia Civilis' framing of this Antony-Octavian beef. I mean, I think he's largely correct, but I think he leans a little too heavily on defending Antony at the expense of Octavian. And what I'm realizing is this is probably just due to his dislike of Octavian again. I think that, Historia Civilis says, Antony is just trying to defend Roman interests, strengthen the Roman East. This is true, but, I mean, come on. He's trying to strengthen his own power base, and he's definitely, I think, giving too much power to Egypt. I would put a little more emphasis on that. And like I said, Octavian is definitely dishonest, and you'll see that in War and Peace and War, but I think Antony kind of has put himself in this position. Maybe he's become too detached or aloof from the interests of the Roman citizens or Roman politics, but I do think Antony sort of stepped into this trap, and Octavian's just gone from there. Anyway, I really enjoyed this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, check out the Patreon and channel memberships through which you can get exclusive reactions. Anyway, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.